Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this live stream on the Mojo Story, our independent digital platform where we return news to the people and focus on the issues that really matter. A very special guest is going to be up a moment from now, and I know a lot of you have signed up to be part of this conversation, to ask him questions. I'm talking about Congress Member of Parliament, Shashi Tharoor, who is out with a new book called The Battle of Belonging. Very intriguingly, the book raises the question of what nationalism and patriotism mean for this, the modern time, at a time when some would say that the BJP has virtually laid ownership to the idea of nationalism. The book asks the fundamental question: what does it mean to be an Indian today? Let me welcome Shashi to the program and to this conversation. Thank you very much, Shashi. Always a pleasure talking to you. And I have to first ask you, before we get to the meat of the book, how do you manage to be a full-time politician and be so prolific? How long did it take you to write this book? How do you do it?
To be honest,
I mean, how? And I'm hoping you're going to say this in words that are simple and that I don't have to reach my thesaurus to decode.
Oh, come on, Barkha. You don't have to fall into that particular cliche. The truth is, I don't sleep enough, and I also, perhaps, as a famous American humorist once put it, I write faster than anybody who writes better than anybody who writes faster too. In some reasons, I think of not enough sleep and fairly rapid with the keyboard helps. But having said that, obviously this book could not have been done without the pandemic lockdown, because in the normal course, I do spend a lot of time running around my constituency and running around the country, particularly addressing various audiences and conferences. And in the normal course, I simply wouldn't have had this much of concentrated time in front of my computer keyboard with a chance to actually organize my thoughts. This book was actually going to be a longer project, culminating somewhat later perhaps, but the lockdown suddenly gave me the opportunity to organize my research in a very comprehensive and concentrated way, and then to write in a kind of white heat. So the actual writing took me just about 3.5 months. The book was done between the beginning of May and the middle of August. It really was. It was an intense sort of, obviously, writing several hours every day. And then here we are. So, I mean, the book does represent not just those 3.5 months of writing, but a lifetime of thinking about these issues and of engaging with these ideas. And so the idea of having a book on nationalism had always been there for some time. I remember reading Rabindranath Tagore's essays on nationalism and lamenting the fact that despite all we've been through in the centuries since then, that we haven't actually come up with a new take on what has happened to Indian nationalism since those magisterial words of Rabindranath Tagore. And so I decided to try and have a crack of it. It's not any Tagorean pretensions, but rather to take stock of a lot of things that have happened since Guru Dev Ji's lifetime.
So the book is here in front of me, The Battle of Belonging. And I think I was really intrigued by what it says right below. It says, on nationalism, patriotism, and what it means to be an Indian. So before we get to the meat of it, and there's lots to talk about, what does it mean for you to be an Indian? The book opens with your telling the story. The book opens with your telling the story of having been born in Britain. And some would say that explains that clipped English accent. But the emphasis of your story is to say that you could have been a British citizen, but you chose to be an Indian citizen at every stage of your life. You could have been, a citizen of any other country, especially after your UN stint. But this is where you wanted to belong. My question is this: do you feel today that you belong somewhat less than you did, let's say, about 20 years ago?
No, the belonging doesn't change, but anxiety about it has certainly grown, because the India to which I returned in 2008-9, towards the end of 2008, was definitely an India which was recognizably a continuation of the India I'd grown up in. See, I moved back from England when I was 2.5, so I assure you my accent has very little to do with England. This is the way I was taught to speak in Bombay. But that's neither here nor there. The fact is, I grew up in India from the age of 2.5 to the age of 19.5, before going out to graduate school abroad. Then I studied abroad, worked abroad in the United Nations and elsewhere, and returned to India after a considerable period of time, basically 34 years. And in that period of time, India had grown, evolved, changed, gone through various stresses and strains, but was still the India of the freedom movement of Gandhi and Nehru and secular liberal constitutionalism as enshrined in Ambedkarji's constitution. All of that was very clear. And I came back to such an India where, for example, the celebration of pluralism was taken for granted. I had made speeches all over America in my Indian writer hat, not my UN official hat, in which I had talked about how we weren't just a sort of melting pot like the Americans, we were a thali, because we had so many multiple identities. And I said, we're like a number of dishes in different bowls, which belong in different bowls, and therefore they don't necessarily flow into each other, but they belong together on that same platter, and they combine on your palate to give you the satisfying repast of being an Indian. That metaphor, which I had dined out on, as it were, for so many years, was to me very profound, because it seemed to me that one of the core things about being Indian was this diversity, the celebration of difference, of acceptance of difference, of pluralism. And then I came to India, and that was very much the India I found myself amidst. I made speeches on soft power and so on, in which that was very much the message I was giving of why India was valued and respected around the world. And then we have the phenomenon of 2014 and its aftermath. And since 2014, what we have seen, Barkha, is a very systematic and sustained assault on those basic underpinnings of what Indianness is all about and what Indian nationhood is all about. Because those who have come to power were not participants in the freedom struggle, or that gave us the nationalism of the freedom struggle, and therefore that was embodied in the Constitution. What they are is an alternative view of Indian nationhood, one that is anchored not so much in diversity, pluralism, and difference, anchored in liberal institutions through which cooperation is built, but rather is a nationalism of identity, and that identity is summarized, as you know, by the Hindutva movement in the phrase Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. And this idea is not the idea of the Constitution. It's a very different idea of what being an Indian national means. And because of that, the whole notion of what it means to be an Indian is under strain in a way it wasn't when I came back to India and celebrated Indianness. That's the dilemma I try and explore in the book.
But let me put it to you that what you call an assault on that classical idea of Indianness is something that the people of this country, as reflected in how they vote, seem to be buying into. And I would further argue that the biggest mistake, I believe, that liberals in India have sometimes made is to cede the space of nationalism, sentimentalism about the state, the little symbolic sort of metaphors of nationhood completely to the right wing, so that constitutional patriotism, which could have been embraced by some of you as your mantra, has now become virtually the property of the right wing, and successfully so. So isn't this your own failure? Isn't this the grand liberal failure?
Okay, there are many things there in your question I need to unpack. First, you talk about the fact that the people of India voted for this version of nationalism. I'm not sure I buy this theory, because let's face it, 31% in 2014, 37% in 2019, they do not represent a majority of the Indian electorate.
You can't argue vote shares, Shashi, then, because
Congress
in the UPA years also got 28% of the vote shares, so this can go on. Let's focus on the fact that you're dealing with a new politics today, and you need to make an adjustment to it.
But I don't accept the proposition that the bulk of the Indian people have bought into this message, because even amongst those who voted for the BJP, there are some who voted because of national security issues, some who voted because of economic issues, some who voted for a gas connection or a toilet. So let's not get carried away that Hindutva is everybody's agenda. It's not. But having said that,
I didn't say Hindutva. I'm talking about nationalism, ceding nationalism to the right wing.
So that's your second point in that question. Yeah. And on that, I happen to agree with you. In fact, I published an article in 2014 making precisely this point, and I've said this privately as well to the Congress leadership, that it's bizarre for us to surrender nationalism to the very side, as it were, that didn't participate in the nationalist movement. We are the original party of Indian nationalism. We need to stand up for our heritage and we need to embrace it. I certainly, as you know, Barkha, have within the Congress party been a bit of a hawk on foreign policy issues, because that's really where I come from in terms of my vision of the world. But I think it's entirely consistent with the legacy that the Congress party lays claim to. And I don't think we need to apologize or yield to the BJP at all on nationalism, given that our credentials for fighting for Indian nation and Indian freedom are simply not even rivaled, let alone matched, by the Hindutva movement or the BJP, which is now its heir.
Why are you not perceived that way? Why do you think that you are not perceived that way? Why is the Congress seen as woolly-headed? And let me draw an analogy from the United States of America. Whatever be the differences between the Republicans and the Democrats, there is there's very little difference, for example, in how they respond to their veterans, to their military, to often foreign policy issues. We have not been able to reach that national consensus on some of our most pressing issues. And therefore, the Congress gets pushed into one side as a sort of woolly-headed liberals, the guys who won't stand up for the military, the guys who don't understand the romance of the uniform, of the anthem, of the tricolor. That's how you're perceived today.
And I don't understand why, because the Congress party actually has helped build up this army and the Navy and the Air Force. Our contribution as a percentage of GDP in Congress and UPA budgets to build up the military has been consistently greater than the BJP's. The percentage has been shrinking every year for the last 6 years under the BJP government. What the BJP is very good at is propaganda. They thump their chests, they celebrate in a very unseemly way the surgical strikes and so on. It completely elides the fact that there were more strikes of the same nature undertaken during the Congress time, but for sensible diplomatic and strategic reasons, we didn't thump our chest and talk about them, and we never politicized the army. Whereas the BJP doesn't just politicize the army, they put military actions on their election posters, they help encourage Bollywood films on this, and they go around thumping their 56-inch chest and talking about how much they're doing for the military. The sort of fetishizing of the Indian military is something the BJP is specialized in and that the public has bought. Now, you may turn around and say, well, that's why they have the image of being big, strong patriots and nationalists. You guys don't. I'd like to think that you can measure us by our results. We've prosecuted successfully the wars of 65 and 71, did less, while I agree, in 62, but we used military power very effectively to put down a coup in the Maldives in 1988. We have been using military power when needed, for example, in Sri Lanka, though with obviously less success. We have also tried to use it whenever the nation was threatened. Operation Brass Tacks being an example, though fortunately it didn't need to lead to war. So the Congress has nothing to apologize for. We are not the ones who either sort of traipsed off at a moment's notice to consort with Pakistan shortly before a terrorist attack on our country. We're not the ones who went off and released terrorists from prison and took them to Kandahar.
Question on your screen then is relevant. Saurabh Suri saying, why isn't the Congress then able to market their ideas like the BJP does? Politics is about communication. Politics is about telling a story.
Well, I have to tell you, I do whatever communication I can as an individual, and I believe so do some of our other leaders in their own areas, their own states, and in their own domains. But yes, the BJP is better organized, better funded, and therefore reaches more people more effectively than we've been able to. I believe we're catching up. I mean, I think what happened between 2014 and 2019 that established a BJP dominance in social media is no longer the case. I think the Congress gives as good as it takes, as good as it gets in social media today. But, for example, the tens of thousands of organized WhatsApp groups the BJP has built up, which relentlessly relay effective messages on the BJP side to sliced and diced target groups. That's something we've not been able to replicate. And I'll admit that right away. That's one example. And this general sort of, capturing of a certain media space that the BJP has done unabashedly has also required it to be in power to be able to do that, because the combination of either cajoling or cudgeling the media, the Bollywood film industry, television channels, even the print newspapers, this has been made possible because they have power, they have all sorts of instruments at their disposal that the Congress party, to its credit, did not misuse when it was in power. And therefore, This means
Okay.
they have a very pliant media marketing their message.
Well, you were among what was sort of colloquially called the G23, the group of 23 who wrote a letter asking for changes in the party, how the leadership issue was being addressed, how ideological drift was being addressed. The question on the screen says, I think the Congress is unable to reach common people with their agenda. I think that there is clearly an apprehension within your own mind about the future of the Congress. There's one thing to have a view on where India is headed. There's also another thing to have a view over whether the Congress has the grammar, the idiom that is needed to convey that message in present day India. And obviously you are concerned, otherwise you wouldn't have written that letter.
Okay, well, I didn't write the letter; I signed it. But let me say that the reason for doing that was reflective of a particular period in the party when there did seem to be a perception of drift that was widely shared, because we had a president who had resigned, an interim president who was appointed and who was going through serious health issues, and there was therefore some concern at that time that the party was lacking a sense of direction and purpose. The message has been heard, it's been taken up. We are seeing, for example, Rahul Gandhi returning to the stump with renewed vigor. We've seen him campaign in Bihar.
He's on vacation in the middle of the Bihar election. He is on a vacation in the middle of the Bihar election, Mr. Gandhi.
He's been campaigning there, Barkha, and he's going to go back there. And I think you'll see when the Bihar results come out how well the Mahagathbandhan does, and then we can talk about whether our message is reaching people or not. But let me say, Barkha, in all seriousness, that the message that we are trying to convey is at multiple levels. There's a message that we reach educated intellectuals through forums like this one, through talking to people like you, through books and speeches, and through platforms like my All India Professionals Congress, which I still chair. And we are reaching a group of people that way. And I must say that I believe our message is resonating very well with that community, because we get feedback all the time. We are also reaching increasingly the young student community. We are reaching the farmers, particularly after the recent farm bills, and we're reaching a number of poor and marginalized people. The disaster of the migrant laborers, how badly they were treated, ignored, and neglected. You reported so brilliantly and effectively on that. All of that has created an awakening or a reawakening of interest in our message. So let me say that I don't believe our message is not being heard. And remember, India is a very vast country. The BJP has a stranglehold essentially in a number of states which dominantly reflect the ethnic composition of the BJP's own leadership and so on. But in many parts of India, the South being a very striking example, the BJP's message is not resonating as effectively as alternative messages, sometimes by the Congress, sometimes by regional parties, which have more affinities with us than with the BJP. We'll see how it goes. I'm not here to suddenly pretend that everything is wonderful and we are poised to take over tomorrow. There is an uphill road to climb, and there is a tough job to sell it. But what I'm saying is that at various levels of this country, we have a case to make. And I'm making one case to one segment of our thinking public, our electorate. And I hope that they will also listen to it and read it.
So let's come back to the book and your exploration of nationalism and patriotism and Hindutva and Hinduism. And some would say that nationalism plus Hindutva has provided the BJP a kind of winning combination, along with certain other factors, the microeconomic schemes of the BJP, the perception of Modi as a 24/7 politician, many factors which we can get into. But does the Congress need a different ideology for the time we live in? And I'm going to pick up something that's just happened, right? And that is a reference to what's happening in France. The Islamist attack that has taken place, Macron standing up and saying that, look, we are here to defend the right to our cartoons because we think this is a free speech issue. And we believe that we need to take a position against this. Now, there have been protests in Muslim countries across the world. It has become a major fault line. And in Telangana today, it was reported that the Congress is backing this sort of sentiment, to which a number of liberal commentators kind of jumped on that and said, this is why the BJP will keep winning elections. So this is what I want to ask you about as someone who in the past has spoken against Indira Gandhi's emergency, as someone who has been against your own party's decision to ban the satanic verses. You are confronted today with a question that tests your ideology on pluralism and the place of religion in a modern society.
Yeah, I mean, I'm confronted because you're asking the question, but not because this issue is particularly live in India. I think the French have a very strong notion of secularism, as they call it, laïcité, which is quite different from the Indian notion of secularism. The French notion ruthlessly excludes religion from the public space. For example, you cannot go into any government office or even a government school wearing a turban, a yarmulke, a hijab, or for that matter, a crucifix. Ultimately, religion has to be ruthlessly excluded from government institutions and the public space. That's very unusual because in India, as we know, we have interpreted secularism to privilege a profusion of religions. All religions are encouraged to flourish, and you will see all that attire in any government office or any public institution in India. So our secularism is not the same as French secularism, but the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which we took from the French Revolution into our constitution, the principle of freedom of expression in Article 19 of our constitution, which the Supreme Court has upheld through so many judgments, these are extremely important. And yet, Barkha, as a liberal Indian, I have had to face the absolute reality that freedoms do not mean the same thing in every part of the world. That you can go to France and take off your bikini top on the beach of Saint-Tropez and no one will give you a second look. But you try that on a beach in Goa or in Kovalam or in Marina Beach in Chennai, and there will be a mob scene, you'll be arrested. So the fact is that cultures do interpret the same principles of freedom differently. In India, perhaps because of our substantially larger Muslim population than the French have, we do understand when Muslims tell us that cartoons of their, or any drawings or images or purported other depictions of their prophet would offend them and offend them very deeply as an insult. We understand that. And so we would say that it is not necessary to assert freedom of expression by causing that kind of offense. In fact, going back to the...
A teacher was beheaded in a classroom.
That we don't excuse. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I condemn that unreservedly. I condemn even a knife attack, any violence. We saw an incident in Kerala where a teacher's hand was cut off at the wrist. I condemned at the time, and I condemn again unreservedly any such actions. Violence is never justified, whatever the provocation. But at the same time, when you know that provocation could erupt and that lives could be lost and that violence and disorder would obtain, naturally, you have to be cautious with a different threshold, a different yardstick in India from what you would have in France. So we stand with the French in their absolute abhorrence of this appalling violence. 100% stand with the French on that, and I support the government having expressed India's support for France on that. But at the same time, I would urge my compatriots to be sensitive within the Indian context to the absolutely undeniable fact that we know how easy it is to inflame passions on sensitive religious issues. Why give people a provocation? Whether it is Muslims objecting to cartoons, whether it is Hindus objecting to paintings of goddesses, our country seems to have a lower threshold. And as a policymaker, my answer would be, listen, I defend your right to light a match, but I don't want you to light a match in a petrol pump. It's as simple as that. And in many of these ways, we are a petrol pump.
You're basically saying that there is no free speech when it comes to religion. You're saying that as a public intellectual, as someone who was an author before he was a politician, and people who sort of like Shashi Tharoor, the author, but don't necessarily care one way or the other about Shashi Tharoor, the politician, are going to be disappointed.
No, but Barkha, I'm trying to explain to you that there can't be that watertight distinction. As an author, my freedom of expression matters to me. So my constitution grants me, for example, the right to criticize my government, and that therefore, when I criticize my government, I should be able to say my views openly, and my constitution protects that. My constitution doesn't actually, and the laws of India don't protect me if I insult or abuse other people's religions. In fact, going back to the British colonial days, there's a law that prohibits me from doing that, going back to 1928. And the Indian government has upheld this law subsequently. There have been prosecutions about people who have been careless. And sadly, there's been violence, riots, and everything in our country over real or imagined provocations. I have written, by the way, Barkha, that we should not grant people an imaginary right to be offended, because that would be a free pass to people to object to any sort of expression by other people saying, I'm offended, I'm offended. There's got to be sensible yardsticks.
That's the precise question on the screen. Narendra Kumar, is Shashi Tharoor saying the freedom of expression is allowed as long as it does not offend someone?
No, I'm not saying, thank you, Narendra Kumar, that's well saying. I'm saying no, freedom of expression is allowed as long as it doesn't transgress the laws of our country and the protections of our constitution. Unfortunately, causing serious enough offense to provoke violence or a riot is in fact against the law in our country. We don't have the absolute freedom of expression that, say, the American First Amendment gives us. Article 19 is a qualified right to freedom of expression. So I'm saying, as an Indian citizen living in India and upholding the Indian constitution and Indian laws, I have no choice but to respect those sensitivities, plus an awareness of Indian culture tells me that you can stand up tomorrow and say, there is no God, I'm a rationalist, there are rationalist societies in our country. And no one can say I'm offended by that. Tough. You can be offended, doesn't matter. But you cannot insult the sacred tenets of either of the major faiths, or for that matter, even of a relatively minority faith. You remember the huge controversy over the last temptation of Christ amongst the Christian community in this country, which is 2.2% of our country. The laws actually protect that kind of offense. I
think the question would be that are those laws archaic, like so many of our laws, that if you believe in free speech, there should be a certain absolutism to it. And I'll tell you why I'm talking about France while we're talking about your book. I'm asking you about France because there is an argument that the Congress needs a new grammar when it comes to talking about pluralism, right? And I say this because A, you are now in alliance in Maharashtra with the Shiv Sena, not famous for its pluralism, one. B, there is a certain hollowing out of secularism as a phrase. It's become politically corroded. C, there is a sense, and even the A.K. Antony report had said this, that the Congress is perceived to be anti-Hindu. 4, you people have flirted with the Hindutva light. Your party leader, Rahul Gandhi, has even flaunted through spokespeople his caste thread, the Janayu. So there is a complete crisis of identity, it seems, within the Congress party. Hence, I'm very intrigued to ask you what, in fact, it is to be Indian, because it seems to me that if not you, your party is certainly confused.
Well, look, I've addressed every one of the issues you mentioned at some length in the book, and I hope that people will read it and engage with me at that level, because my answer is that I'm not sure that this is actually a totally fair depiction either of the Congress party or of the alternative position to the dominant Hindutva narrative. You see, I mean, I've also written a different book called Why I'm a Hindu, in which I've explained that the Hinduism that I celebrate is the Hinduism of people like Swami Vivekananda, who taught me the importance of accepting difference, who taught me that all paths, however different they may be from each other, will lead ultimately to the same sense of the divine. And that is why Hinduism does not impose its narrow definitions on anyone else. And that's actually been a very good prescription for being Hindu in a multi-religious society, just as that kind of attitude that it embodies is a very useful way of actually managing diversity in a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic society and polity that India is. So the India that I celebrate is one where we acknowledge we're all minorities. You know, if you're not a religious minority, you may be in a linguistic minority. If you're not in a linguistic minority, you might be in an ethnic minority or a caste minority as well, and so on.
But you didn't answer my question. I know it's in the book, but you could... The crisis of identity in the Congress, not having a grammar for the pluralism message that is effective, that is seen as consistent, that you have compromised when needed to. For example, in your alliance with Maharashtra, now you may say you have centered the Shiv Sena into not being a sort of ethno-nationalist, strident right-wing party, but the fact is that it was. The fact that you have, the caste thread reference, which I remember in an interview to me, you said you disagreed with that being referenced in an election campaign. So, there's stuff going on here. And
I'm not a Congress spokesman, and I haven't written the book.
I know. So I'm asking you as you, Shashi. Yeah.
So you, Shashi, speaking purely as an individual, and remember, I grew up in Mumbai or Bombay, as it then was, when the Shiv Sena was on the rise. And I was a South Indian kid, so I don't know how many of you remember that the Shiv Sena began life as an anti-South Indian party. So I must say I'm very conscious of the history of the Shiv Sena. They have evolved a lot. And what's interesting about their evolution is they're the party that nominated a South Indian like T.N. Seshan for the presidency of this country. They're a party that made a liberal like Pritish Nandi a Rajya Sabha MP. So there's complexities there that you really have to look at before we characterize the Shiv Sena in one way or the other. But what's most important is in any Gathbandhan, any coalition, there is a common minimum program or understanding, which certainly the Shiv Sena has not breached. And therefore, there is a common basis for the Shiv Sena and two secular parties, the NCP and the Congress, to work with it and have been working so far very effectively with it, even in the face of the relentless assaults of the central government and the BJP. So I would say that is not in itself an indication. It's if the Congress party had diluted its secularism in order to participate in a Shiv Sena-led government, then you could make that question a fair one. But given that it's a Shiv Sena that has actually come a long way to support the NCP Congress position rather than insisting on Hindutva in its own political policies, it seems to me that we have come out with a very good modus vivendi with the Shiv Sena. On other things, Hindutva light, I've actually challenged this business of Rahul Gandhi's going to temples being misunderstood, because like him, I mean, in my constituency, I go to temples, to mosques, to churches, and in Kochi even to a synagogue. And I have absolutely no problem with any of that, because the truth is that it's a way of showing respect to your constituents by showing respect to the places they consider holy and important. It's nothing to do per se with one particular religious ideology. And let me add in further that you will see that Congress leaders are celebrating the special occasions of every faith. And when you come to Kerala, you'll have no doubt about Congress secularism. There is no Hindutva like that, because we stand resolutely against the Hindutva message. And finally, on the question of identity, my entire argument in this book is that we need to move away from an identity that is linked to primordial things about our birth, like our religion, like our caste, like our color, even the language we grow up speaking, and instead celebrate civic nationalism and nationalism of institutions, and nationalism of agreed processes. As I've said many times,
define those, because your book does talk about civic nationalism, as opposed to the sort of more European-style idea of nationalism, which is political nationalism. And then there is a kind of constitutional patriotism, which is a phrase that some prefer. So how do you see these three as different? I know you have a hard out in a few minutes from now, so we'll go as long as you can. But talk a little bit about this civic nationalism.
Yeah, so civic nationalism is an idea that basically says you can subscribe to it even if you don't have a primordial affiliation. It's like, for example, an immigrant to America who neither was born there, nor is white, nor is Christian, nor was educated there, can go there, become a citizen, and participate in dreaming the American dream. And that civic nationalism is ultimately something that is very distinct from the ethno-religious nationalism of those who say it's a blood of color, of religion, and so on, that determines one's allegiance. So that kind of civic nationalism is what the Constitution created in India. It didn't matter whether you were Hindu or Muslim or chose to have no faith. It didn't matter, for that matter, if you were white. As you know, some white people took the Indian passports after independence, and I've mentioned two or three of them.
You talk about, sorry to intervene there, but because it's the same college that we both went to, St. Stephen's College.
Right.
And you talk about David Baker being this professor, this cult figure who wanted Indian citizenship, and how he was viewed with such a suspicion. I know it's a slightly navel-gazing question, but being from college, I do want you to use Baker Saab's example as an illustration of what you're talking about.
I was in college when he was going through the struggle, and there he was, after classes and so on, getting onto a bus, poor chap, and going off to one government office after another. And I said, there were so many Stephanian alumni in high positions in government, why don't you ask one of them to help you? And he wouldn't do it. He was a man of principle and integrity. Plus, he said, why should anyone be suspicious of me? What possibly negative agenda could I have for being Indian? And anyway, after a while, I think they gave him the runaround for a few years before they finally realized there was absolutely no reason why they should deny him the right to be Indian, at a time when many Indians would have craved the right to be Australian, which is what he was. And he cheerfully gave up his Australian passport, became Indian. JBS Haldane became an Indian at a time when there were so many foreign exchange restrictions and so on, that being an Indian was not exactly a privilege. And he said that he particularly enjoyed being an Indian because of the diversity that Indianness represented, far more diverse, he said, than any country in Europe. And then, of course, he said, India's democracy gives me the right to be a nuisance to my own government. which is something that I personally celebrate because I'm a nuisance to my own government also. And I think that is part of being a proud nationalist in a civic national system, underpinned by liberal constitutionalists. Because for us, our rights are written down in the Constitution, they're enshrined. They've been supported by 70-odd years of Supreme Court judgments. There's a whole tradition now that's built up as to what being an Indian entitles you to under the Constitution of India. Why should one relinquish any of that or feel a need to relinquish any of that?
But tell me, when you talk about nationalism, but at the same time, you personally, along with a few others in your party, have taken a very distinct position on what happened in Kashmir. And you've called the abrogation of 370 and the detention of the mainstream leaders the political equivalent possibly of demonetization. Do you not worry that this will create a backlash in the rest of the country? Because the one thing that the Kashmir move has got is pretty much support outside of the valley. A large sort of thumbs up from General Janta.
Yes, I know. In fact, the interesting thing, Barkha, is, as I pointed out in the book as well, even Jawaharlal Nehru pointed out this was a temporary provision. The provision itself was not what was sacrosanct. What was, however, was the procedure by which it was meant to be changed, if ever. And that procedure required consultation with the elected representatives of the Kashmiri people, as well as, of course, with the constitutional processes that the law provided for, and the government essentially rode roughshod over all of those. And so I pointed out in the book as well that it's the violence to India's constitution and to India's democratic integrity that I was deploring, not necessarily the outcome. Gandhiji taught us that even desirable ends should not be fulfilled through immoral means. Mm-hmm. And that's not a lesson that the BJP government seems to have learned. For them, if the end is popular, it didn't matter if they've broken every democratic convention to trample roughshod over the rights of the Kashmiri people in order to achieve that popular end. And that's why, I do believe, and of course, we've seen the reaction of all the Kashmiri political parties in the Gupta Declaration and so on. I do believe we still have a problem. I would agree entirely that since I made my speech in the Lok Sabha on the 5th of August, that my direst predictions of that time have not necessarily come true, though terrorism has increased as I warned it would. Just judging by Home Ministry figures, there have been more terrorist incidents in Kashmir after this than before. But I still think that there are principles involved. And by the way, the particular constitutional trick that was used by the government to ride around the provisions that would have prevented them from doing what they did to Article 370 can actually now be applied to any state in the Union. They can essentially declare president's rule anywhere under the Constitution, and their governor can claim to speak for the state.
So what part is the political equivalent of demonetization? Because what I'm hearing you say is that it's not the abrogation per se that brings out your resistance, but what's happened since then or how it was done.
How it was done, and therefore what might yet happen since. In the case of demonetization, of course, the actual act itself was folly. And the way it was done and sprung and unleashed upon the nation, the colossal amount of costs, human costs that were paid, the 135 people who lost their lives in the process, the enormous amount of financial damage, and the 2.2% immediate blow to our GDP, which then resulted in spiraling unemployment, all before COVID made things 10 times worse. All of that has been a calamitous body blow to the nation.
Shashi, when you see the fact that 3 BJP workers were assassinated in a terror attack in the last couple of days, there are those who will believe that these are on these issues the Congress is not with the mainstream. Or Shashi Tharoor, I won't say the Congress. Shashi Tharoor is not with the mainstream. He's attached to an abstract idea that the country doesn't actually support.
Look, you think I'm in favor of BJP workers being killed for any reason?
No. I'm saying that maybe the argument would be, I'm not giving you my argument, I'm giving you an argument. The argument would be that there is a perception, the anger against terrorist violence in Kashmir is so strong in the rest of the country that there is no patience left to uphold the historicity of the special place in the Indian Union, and that is what the BJP has bet on.
Yeah, that may actually be true. But at the same time, do you, as an Indian Democrat, an Indian citizen, value the rights and privileges the Constitution has given you? Would you like those rights and privileges only to be taken away after due process, due discussion, due deliberation? Or do you feel that just because something seems to you a desirable objective, that you can completely trample over all these rights and provisions. For me, even if you think it's merely an abstract point of view, it's actually a very important point of view, because if it can be done to Kashmir today, it can be done to any other part of India tomorrow on some other grounds. It won't be Article 370, that was only Kashmir, but there are very many other things that the government can do. Already, in a very minor example, what happened with on the 24th of March was the government using a rather obscure provision of the National Disaster Management Act to completely ride roughshod over states' rights and impose a lockdown upon states that had not been consulted. And you must remember that health is supposed to be a state subject, and law and order is supposed to be a state subject, and both those subjects were involved when it came to cracking a lockdown and enforcing it with policemen's batons. How did they do that? They found one really obscure provision of a law that most people had not paid any attention to, and which had largely been ignored, and including by the government when they failed to name enough disaster management authority commissioners for 11 months after they came to power. But that's neither here nor there. The fact is that they use that to just ride roughshod over the rest of the states. They have an attitude that says once we decide to do something, we'll find a way. It doesn't matter what the law and the constitution may have otherwise required, and even less does it matter what political convention built up over 72 years of flabby or woolly-minded liberal rule, whatever you want to call it. Now, it little matters what those conventions are. We'll ignore the conventions. Now, that's something that I find very troubling, Barkha, because I believe these things protect all of us, and that when we speak about Indian nationalism, the nation that we are exalting must be a nation that works for every Indian. That's really key.
Finally, before we let you go,
last question.
5 things you think liberals have got wrong that need to change.
I don't even know if they're 5, and I don't want to give a facile list like that.
Okay, give me one thing. Give me one thing.
Well, I think you have put your finger on the Kashmir issue, which is one that clearly liberals who value constitutionalism seem to be out of sorts with majority sentiment. But I would not, for example, have wanted to include something like national security on that. I would say that, you're going back to your earlier question, that on the perception front, liberals have found themselves in the wrong place, that we are perceived as not caring as much, which is simply, as I said, not justified by our record. But nonetheless, there is a perception. We need to fight that perception and overcome it. There are 2 examples for you. But there are many more things I believe we've got right that we need to stand up for and defend. And I'm trying to do some of that in this book as well.
Okay, Shashi, pleasure talking to you. Shashi Tharoor's The Battle of Belonging is now out. Do pick it up. You don't have to agree with Shashi on everything, but his books are always fascinating and make you think. And I think that's what it should be all about in a democracy, having an interesting conversation. We have just stopped doing that. So I think that's what we're trying to return to on this platform. And Shashi, thank you. Thank you so much for the book and for the conversation. Thanking our audience and signing off now. We'll see you tomorrow again. Thanks, Shashi.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.